Wonder which leadership and people skills are needed to run a multi-billion-dollar business? This week on Bootstrapped, the lighter side, we talk with Ken Wilcox, the former CEO of Silicon Valley Bank, to get his take on the skills you need to be a successful leader and people manager. We also dig into his book, Leading Through Culture, where he shares why company culture is vital to success. Welcome to Bootstrapped, the lighter side, the podcast for B2B startup founders wanting to achieve success without giving up ownership or control. This podcast is brought to you by Lighter Capital, the leader in founder-friendly financing for B2B SaaS companies. Learn more at lightercapital.com. I am excited to be here today with my guest, Ken Wilcox. He has a very impressive career, but today we're going to focus primarily on his time at Silicon Valley Bank, where he spent 20 years, 10 years of those as its CEO, presiding over a great era for the bank, and really a time that was widely believed to have cemented the culture that led to the bank's success in the first part of this decade. And we're going to also dig into Ken's book, Leading Through Culture. Ken, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks very much for having me.
We won't spend a lot of time on this, but as I was looking through your background, I was so surprised to see that prior to going into business, you were a German professor and you actually have a PhD in German studies. And you did that and taught German before going on to Harvard Business School and going into banking. So I just quickly would love to know how that transition took place, because I imagine at HBS, you were probably the only one with a PhD in German studies, maybe in your class and at any time.
Yeah, that's how I got in, I think. I feel
the diversity tip, huh?
They wanted one person who was strange, I think. First of all, I didn't set out to become a professor. It was one of those kinds of things that was during the Vietnam War era. And as long as you stayed in school, you weren't going to get drafted. Yeah. I majored in German because I was simply interested in things international. And I could have picked almost any language except my mother's German, so it gave me a little bit of a leg up. But the problem is, once you do something like that, if you decide to get a PhD in anything unusual, you don't have that many choices when you're done. It turns out that the only person who's interested in hiring you would be a university. And so I went that route, and I taught for a few years, but I didn't actually enjoy it to the extent that I should have if I was going to stay. And in particular, I didn't like being poor, because that was in an era which some people remember in the early 1980s, late 70s, early 1980s, when inflation was double digit and raises at universities in the humanities were 2%. So conceptually, I lost half my buying power every year.
Yeah.
And I had no choice.
So that was the reason to switch careers and go into business.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that, and then we'll get into the book and culture. But let's talk about your banking career.
Yeah. So I went to Harvard Business School, and to be honest, I didn't even know there was such a thing when I quit my job teaching in the German department at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. So I went. And I spent my 2 years there. I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do when I got out. A friend of mine at the school said to me, well, why don't you try something that's very general, like commercial banking, because it'll expose you to a lot of different industries. And then you'll get a better idea of what's out there and what might suit you and what you might enjoy. So I did that. I was very fortunate. The very first job I got in commercial banking was at a bank in Boston that no longer exists. It's now part of B of A. It was a 140-year-old bank called Shawmut, and I was happy to be in the venture-backed group. And that exposed me to what we now call venture debt. So I started out making loans that were referred to as venture debt, and liked it so much that I really never changed the field. I joined that bank in 1983. Within 3 or 4 years, I discovered that I hated my boss. So I moved to the Bank of New England, which was similarly sized company, also 140 years old. 1990, there was this recession, a real estate oriented recession in New England. And actually, all the banks, with one exception, were put out of business by the Federal Reserve and ended up being acquired almost all by a Bank of America. And at that point in time, I didn't want to go to Bank of America. I'm not sure they wanted me to go to them either. So I started looking around and I found this tiny little bank in Silicon Valley. It had fewer than 100 people at the time. It was 7 years old at that point in time, had about 90 people, I think. I called them up and asked them if they would be interested in having their first branch outside of Silicon Valley in Route 128. And Roger Smith, who was the CEO at the time, jumped on the idea almost instantaneously. And he said, this would be great. It's something I really want to do. So on April 1st, 1990, I and 3 or 4 of my colleagues all quit on the same day, shortly before the bank went under, and moved from the financial district out to Route 128 and set up shop. And then, in a sense, the rest is history, because all the other banks were frozen in place by the Federal Reserve. It was like we had the entire market to ourselves. For 3 years, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. Every single deal we competed for, we won because there were no other competitors.
Right. I have a long history of working with Silicon Valley Bank, and they've been, the consistent player in this space. Right now it's very competitive. It was competitive for the last decade, but much of the decade that you were the CEO, I would say it was not as competitive. You probably didn't feel that way because so many banks exited in the dot-com crash and again in the Great Recession or the global financial crisis. But Silicon Valley Bank was the one steady. So we'll get into that a little bit. But you joined Silicon Valley Bank in 1990 and then became their CEO in 2000. The bank did very well under your leadership, but what I hear most from the people who worked with you, including the chair of Lighter Capital's company, Mark Verissimo, is that you created a fantastic culture and you made culture paramount to the success of the bank. Where did that come from? Why do you think culture is so important? You say something that culture trumps strategy. We always say culture eats strategy for breakfast, and that's a mantra that you've used over and over again. So just talk about what in your career before you became a leader led you to adopt that belief.
Well, there's a lot of little questions bundled up in your big question. Yeah. Let me pick out 3 and answer them. Okay. The first one is, actually, I would credit myself with having done, in some sense, very little over the 10 years that I was CEO. And the 2 things that I would mention would be, 1, what you said about the culture. And the other thing that I did, which I think made a huge amount of difference in terms of the bank's future, was that I focused the bank on technology. Because prior to my becoming CEO, which was actually 2001, the bank had what it called the 3-legged stool strategy, which most people have forgotten, but it was basically we were going to be 1/3 tech, 1/3 real estate, and 1/3 what we called Main Street, which is kind of anything else. That's what we were when I became CEO. And the problem with that was it made us sort of a Me Too bank, because every bank in the country does real estate and does general lending. The only thing we did that was unique was working with technology companies, and in particular venture-backed technology companies. And we developed a level of expertise in that field that others didn't have simply because they didn't do it. But in the other 2 areas, We were just a Me Too player. And by the way, real estate in particular is extremely dangerous for bankers. I would say most of the banks in US history that have gone down because they had bad real estate loans. It's a highly cyclical business. So the first thing that I did was to get rid of 2/3 of the bank. It took about 2 to 3 years to ask all of our customers in real estate and in general lending to go find another bank. And then we filled up that empty 2/3 with technology. Again, because it was the one thing we were really good at. And you may say to yourself, now, why would you do that at the onset of the
dot-com crisis? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a good question. And maybe if I were older at the time and more cautious at the time, I wouldn't have done that. But the truth was, everybody was criticizing me every single day anyway, just for being in technology at the time. The Wall Street people, we were a publicly traded company, a small one, but publicly traded. The Wall Street people were constantly bashing me. It's ridiculous for you to be in technology. So I put on my blinders and stubbornly stuck to the notion that technology was what we're there for, and forged on ahead. And over time, I think that proved to be a really good decision. Two others that are connected with it. One was we started going overseas too, into innovations markets in other countries. First Israel, then India, then the UK, and then China. And the other thing we did was we expanded our product set so that we could accommodate larger companies, because prior to 2001, we'd find a startup, a raw startup, and nurse it along. And by the time it got up to about 25 or 30 million in sales, we would graciously let it wander off to some bigger bank with a bigger product set. And we decided we'd invest, a couple of $100 million at the time in new product that would enable us to keep those companies happier longer.
Right. So in your book, and this sort of gets to what you were just saying, you talk about the 4 Ds of decision making: debate, decide, deliver, and debrief. And what you say is all about consultative decision making. When you make big decisions, there are at least 4 possible approaches. And I loved this. One was democracy, and democracy is a failure to lead. The second is consensus, where, anybody can count votes. So that's not really leadership. And, the third is dictatorship. And, that dictatorship is foolish. And then one thing you said, and I'm wondering how this relates to the big decision you had to make. At times, a leader has to make decisions that are not supported by experts or their stakeholders. And sometimes you have to stand alone. So was this one of those decisions that the experts and the stakeholders weren't necessarily supporting at the time?
You're absolutely right. This was one of those where I would have stood alone had it not been for a couple of loyal souls like your chairman, Mark Verissimo, who saw the wisdom in it. But basically, at the risk of repeating what you just said, I want to underscore
things must be repeated over and over again because people only listen to 30% of what you say.
True.
That's straight from your book. So
that is true. Because most of us, our minds are wandering. I only listen to 30% of what I'm supposedly listening to as well. No, but studies indicate that's actually the case. Audiences don't really listen that much. So you have to repeat yourself and repeat yourself. It's good to vary it so that people who actually are listening to it don't get bored. But in any case, decision making, when I first became CEO, I had never been a CEO before. And quite frankly, my predecessors, they had many fine qualities, but neither of them were, in my opinion, very good at the decision-making process, because they didn't include others in a real way. And I say it's important not just to include others, but it's important to include them in a real way. You can't just pretend that you care about their opinions. You have to care. So I spent a lot of time in my first year trying to study this question. How do you go about making decisions in a corporation in a way that's most effective. And I came to the conclusion that most of the great leaders in history had a system that involved the following. First of all, good leaders only make big decisions. They delegate down. Any decision you can delegate down, you're better off doing it. You should just focus as the leader on the very biggest decisions. If you have a big decision to make, you should call together stakeholders, mostly your direct reports and maybe a couple of experts. And you should explain to them, we have a big decision to make. Are we going to stick with 30% technology, or are we going to expand it to conceptually 100%? And I want to hear your opinions. I want every one of you to express your opinion, even if you think it's not something I want to hear. I do want to hear it. And by the way, if you don't, you're really not deserving what we're paying you, because that's why we pay you the big bucks, so to speak. We pay for your brain and for your expertise. So please share with me your opinions about this. That would be the discussion phase. And that can go on for, 45 minutes. It can go on for 6 hours. It can go on for 3 days, depending on the nature of the decision. But I really want to hear what they think, because no good leader, no matter how good they are, knows everything. And in addition to that, they need to understand how people will respond to a decision. So it's a question of, do I know everything already? No, of course I don't. Can I anticipate how everybody will respond? No, of course I can't. I need that team to tell me what they think.
I thought your book there were so many gems in it. I thought one piece that was especially helpful for me, and I will use it going forward, is describing what kind of meeting it's going to be when you're talking about a big decision, and making sure your team knows that either here's a decision I've made and I want to run it by you to see if it's a dumb decision and get your feedback, or here's something I really don't know now, or I really have not made a decision and I need your help to make that decision. And the importance of setting those expectations in advance so your team, knows exactly what's expected at that meeting.
That's right, because people hate being duped. They don't want to hear you say, I want to know your opinion, if they garner the impression over time that you really don't want to know their opinion. So I don't ask for somebody's opinion unless I really want to know it. That doesn't mean I'm going to follow it 100%. In the end, and I make it very clear, we're not going to vote. This is not a democracy. I'm not even going to go with a majority. We're not looking for a consensus here. What we're looking to do is give me the best information possible so that I can do a better job of making the best decision that I can possibly make. And then at some point in time, when you as the leader feel that the discussion has gone on long enough, whether it's a day or 2 days, you make the decision. And then you go into execution mode. And here's the tricky part. There are 4 Ds, but I'll leave the 4th one off for a minute. There are 3 Ds. The first is the discussion phase. During the discussion phase, everybody in the room has to share their honest view. That may go on for a while. Then the decision, and that may take a split second. You step aside and you say, okay, now I'm going to make the decision, and you make it. Probably takes longer than a split second, and then the 3rd phase is the execution phase, where you carry the decision out. And this is the tricky part. During the discussion phase, people have to share their opinion. During the execution phase, they'd better not share their opinion. Because if you allow them to continue disagreeing after the decision has been made, it'll be so distracting to the troops that you'll not get anything done.
Yeah.
And you can't allow that to happen. And if there's a 4th D, it would be sometime in the future, maybe 3 months later, maybe a year later, you debrief. That is, you go over it with your team and say, Was it the right decision? Or should we revise it? But that comes later.
You say that the most basic obstacle in accomplishing these 4Ds is having passive aggressive or obnoxiously assertive people on the team. So can you dig into that a little bit more?
You go into most corporations and put 10 people in a room, they're going to, in terms of their behavior, the way they work with each other, they're going to fall at various points on a spectrum. In the middle of the spectrum will be the adults. And those are people that know how to work with other adults, how to express opinions, how to listen to other opinions, how to find compromise, how to find joint solutions. Those are the people that really do the best job of helping you. Then there's going to be, usually in most groups, there are a couple of jerks who have gotten used to pushing other people around as a way of getting things done or having their way. And they're the obnoxiously assertive people. They're easy to recognize because they're pushy, they're annoying, they're bossy. Most people don't care to be in the same room with them for very long. They're easy to find. The other end of the spectrum are the passive aggressive people. Those are the people that are sitting there nodding their heads and smiling. No matter what you say, they look at you almost like your puppy dog, and they smile, and they're in effect communicating to you, you're a genius. I agree with everything you say. I'm totally behind you. Those people are worthless in the sense that they're not providing you with any information that will be helpful to you in terms of making a better decision. When I became CEO, I decided that I would do my best. We only had about 1,000 people at the time I became CEO. I decided I would do my best to try to get rid of as many of the obnoxiously assertive people and of the passive aggressive people as I could, initially by identifying them and coaching them to the middle. If we identified them, but we failed to coach them to the middle, we would suggest that they go work someplace else.
What was the success rate of when you identified them being able to coach them to the middle to be, work on I think you call it an adult to adult basis?
Yeah, the success rate with the obnoxiously assertive people was astoundingly high because it's easy to find. And you can coach them. Some of them are coachable, and they realize if they know you're serious, they realize that, hey, I like it here. I'd rather stay. I think I can adapt. Some of them couldn't. There were a couple of notorious cases of people who actually were otherwise quite productive. They were good at their job. They just didn't know how to work with others. And we couldn't get them over the threshold. So we'd start with one-on-one coaching. And if that didn't work, we'd try what's called an intervention. There would be like 6 of us in a room all at once explaining to them that it wasn't going to work the way they were doing it. Please change. And then ultimately, you have the meeting with the HR person and you encourage them to find their fortune elsewhere.
Yeah.
But the passive aggressive people, it's hard to find them because they're always nodding and smiling. And, it's kind of tempting to think that they really do believe you're a genius. And then why would you get rid of somebody who was that loyal?
Yeah. Yeah. How about hiring? Any tricks for being able to identify those personality types, before they come into the organization?
Hiring is a very danger-fraught activity. There are so many minefields out there. It's very, very hard. I don't have a foolproof plan, but what I can tell you is if you ask people, what their negative characteristics are, they'll say things like, well, I don't have any. Or
I work too hard. Yeah.
I work too hard. Exactly. That's
I care too much. Yeah.
Yeah. So you've got to, in effect, give them open-ended questions, affords them the opportunity to express who they really are. And the best method that I ever found, and I'm not sure it was perfect because I certainly made some hiring errors along the way, but the best method I could think of was I would try to pick problems that the corporation faces in real time. And I'd say, this is the problem that we've got. If you were here and you were in charge of solving it, how would you go about it?
Mm.
And if you keep asking them questions along the way, many of them will become quite expansive, and you'll get a feeling for how they go about working with other people. And that they can inadvertently display who they really are in a way that helps you decide if they're a good fit.
Yeah. One of the things that you talked about is that if someone on your team refuses to be vulnerable, a lack of trust and ultimately a lack of communication will follow. Can you dig into that a little bit more? Because you do write a lot about the importance of vulnerability. And I think that's become more mainstream. But I don't think 20 years ago, when you were leading SVB, it was mainstream in terms of culture.
No, I think you're right. I have had some very negative experiences with people who refused to be vulnerable.
Mm.
And ultimately, it almost always ended up with a separation. So, what do I mean by vulnerability? I want to be 100% clear about that. Vulnerability is not equate to wussiness.
Yeah.
We're not looking for people who are prone to tears or are constantly apologizing, constantly enumerating their many negative characteristics. We're simply looking for people who have enough confidence to admit when they don't really know. They think they know, but they acknowledge that it's possible they're wrong. Being able to acknowledge that it's possible you're wrong, or that, oh my gosh, I was wrong regarding something that happened in the past, that's what I call appropriate vulnerability. But there are many, many people, and I can understand how they became this way, because I think their environment encouraged them to behave in the way I'm about to describe. Many people wear a kind of armor, and they refuse to acknowledge that they made a mistake or that they aren't 100% certain of what they're recommending. They feel there are good reasons for recommending what they're recommending, but they don't want us to believe that they're 10,000% certain, because those are the only kinds of people that you can talk to and that you can work with together to arrive at some kind of a solution that is going to be of great benefit, primarily to customers, because decisions should be of great benefit to customers. I'm very customer focused and believe that we should be operating in that vein.
Yeah.
But that's what I call vulnerability. And obviously the obnoxiously assertive people aren't vulnerable because they just keep pushing their own opinion aggressively. And the passive aggressive people, I'm not sure that the word vulnerability applies, because you don't know their opinions anyway. And they just they're like water relative to the rock. They go around it. I had a coach in the first year who was really, really good. And I remember I invited him to come to some of our management committee meetings and just sit on the side and take mental notes. And at that particular meeting, we had in attendance a brand new executive that we'd only hired a week or two before. And I was so proud that we'd hired somebody that I thought was going to be really good. That night, he called me up and he said, it's a good meeting. I like the way you handled it. Everything went fine, but I got to warn you, that person you just brought on, it's not going to work. I said,
I could tell by one meeting.
One meeting. He said, because that person refuses to be vulnerable. And mark my words, within a year, you're going to wish that person weren't there. And it's totally right. I thought the guy was psychic. It was amazing.
Yeah.
How many relationships work out well if there's a lack of vulnerability? It's hard to really like somebody who refuses to be vulnerable. And if you don't really like somebody, I don't mean fall in love with them. I mean just like working with them. It's going to be hard. Yeah, and let me talk just a little bit about some of the characteristics of a good culture, in my opinion. I'll go back and answer the question that you posed earlier, and that is, why was I so focused on culture anyway? I come by this a little bit honestly because my father was one of the early professors of organizational behavior.
Okay.
At the time, I don't think my brothers and I was one of three brothers, really appreciated him because it kind of bored us. He would lecture us at the dining room table at night about everything that he was teaching in organizational behavior. And at the time, we thought, oh my God, another lecture. But
Yeah.
was my father was hung up on this whole concept, which was very prevalent in that era, which would have been, let's say, roughly 50s and 60s, of moving from what they called theory X management style, which was fundamentally a military management style that came
Yeah.
out of people's recent experience in World War II, moving to a what they call theory Y, which was more participative. Somehow that stuff sunk in, even if at the time it sounded boring. And as soon as I got into the workplace, at first Shawmut Bank, then Bank of New England, then Silicon Valley Bank, I became very critical, not openly, but in the back of my mind, of the lead people in positions of leadership because they were largely theory X type people. And I said to myself, there's a better way to do this. My father, who was somewhat of a romantic, had this idea that people should be enjoying their jobs.
Yeah.
Do their
Which
best.
wasn't really the thought in the 60s and 70s, right?
It wasn't. And ultimately, I came up with this metaphor that I used to use in speeches sometimes that people thought it was kind of amusing. And that is that we're targeting a bank where people so enjoy what they're doing and feel that it's so important in terms of what they're contributing to society through their work that almost every SVBer wakes up 5 minutes before the alarm goes off.
Mm.
And then they grab the cover and throw it back, leap out of bed, ready to go forth and save the world. And then I, of course, point out that they were wearing pajamas, so there's nothing
Yeah.
to worry about in this vision. That was for us a big part of it.
I'm going to get back to culture, but there's only, I think, one part of the book that I disagreed with you. And I'd like to get into it a little bit and get your opinion. You had said, and I don't have the exact quote written down, but you had heard that a board meeting where the CEO enjoyed the board meeting was not a good board meeting. And in other words, that the job of the board is to really beat up the CEO and challenge the CEO. And I have to say, the reason I disagree is I was in venture for a long time and sat on a lot of boards, even though I've been a CEO before, small companies twice, and they had successful exits. I sat on a lot of boards and saw these CEOs get beat up, and they're especially the CEOs of startups. One CEO, they've got the hardest job in the world, right? And you need support of your board, which doesn't mean you need your board to agree with everything. You want your board to challenge you and push you, but the idea that the CEO is not supposed to enjoy the board meeting. I mean, I come away from our board meetings mostly invigorated and happy that I have the help that I have and the advice that I have. So I disagreed with you there, but I'd love to hear your side.
Well, at the risk of sounding like I'm being unnecessarily agreeable, I'm on your side here, Melissa, because
Okay.
and maybe I ought to go back and rewrite the page that was
Yeah.
on because that wasn't really me.
You were quoting someone else, but it
It
sounded
was
like you
someone
agreed
else.
with
It
them.
was a guy on my board who's actually a very dear friend. It was the without mentioning names, he was the first venture capitalist I met on my new job in 1983, just months after graduating from Harvard Business School. Turns out he's 6 months older than I am. and had a similar background because he was a professor of pure mathematics. We became fast friends, and we still talk every week after 40 some years. Literally,
Wow.
we talk every week. But he was partly facetious and partly serious. I mean, he's not a perfect guy, especially from a CEO's point of view. But he had two phrases that he loved to repeat. One is what you just said, if the CEO enjoyed the board meeting, it was a bad meeting. And I never really made sure that I didn't enjoy every board meeting too. And the other thing that he used to say, which I do believe in a little bit more, but not quite to the same extent that he does, he used to say the best time to fire somebody is the first time you think of it. Because it's like a hole in the roof. It never gets smaller, it always gets bigger. So those are two adages that I learned from him, but I don't agree with the one about torturing CEOs in board meetings.
Do you agree with the second one? It's something I struggle with going back and forth on that one where, because I've had a couple examples where someone surprised me and ended up doing a lot better than I thought they would, or being a lot more productive than I thought they would.
Yeah, well, this particular friend of mine is the master of the glib remark. That's
Okay.
like an absolute, but really isn't. I sort of agree with it in the sense that I would say in 80% of the cases, rough cut, the hole gets bigger.
Mm.
There are people who are capable of changing. It's important that you give them the benefit of feedback and
Yeah.
fairly directly. One of the big problems many organizations is that they only pretend to give feedback, but they really don't.
Hey, what does that mean?
They give it is when they're, lambasting the other person and
Mm.
something public. But we insisted at SVB that people get feedback on a regular and ongoing basis, and we had reviews 4 times a year.
Four times a year. Okay.
We taught people how to give reviews, managers, and how to give reviews, simple reviews. And then we audited many of them, spot audits, to make sure that they were really doing it. But people should never be surprised in a review, in my opinion.
Mm.
If you surprise them with your review, whether it's quarterly, semi-annual, or annually, you failed as a manager because you should be giving them feedback right along the way. And it doesn't have to be mean, but you can't pull punches.
This was not in your book, but you do talk a lot about the importance of one-on-ones. And I think, I don't know if it's correct to say they've become more important, but in this remote working environment, sometimes, you don't have the water cool conversation. So the one-on-one is the time that you're connecting with especially your direct reports. Do you have advice for running a one-on-one?
I learned from Andy Grove, not personally, but by reading his book on management, which came out, a long time ago. And it's a small book. His book on management encouraged regular reviews. He said that you should focus on what are you doing well and what are you not doing well, and what steps do you need to take in order to improve in those areas where you're not doing well. And so the reason we encourage quarterly reviews was to make sure this stuff didn't get swept under the carpet. They didn't have to be long reviews. They could be 20 minutes. And you didn't have to spend 6 hours preparing them. You could just spend 10 minutes. And if you know your employees, your direct reports well enough, you can at any given point in time say, they're doing this well, they're doing this well, they're doing this well. Here, they're not doing so well. And this is what I think they need to do to improve. And I think the key to reviews is 1, being direct, 2, being frequent, but 3, and this is the hardest part because most of us are so uncomfortable saying negative things to other people that we rev ourselves up into a rage in order to feel comfortable telling. And that's unnecessary. We should be able to speak to them in a way that indicates we fundamentally endorse them as a human being. And there are aspects of working together with them that we enjoy. So I really do like you.
Yeah.
but there's this thing over here that I think you could be doing better. Here's how to fix it. And I can either say it's job threatening, or I can say it's not job threatening, but you'll become much better at what you do if you can fix it. If it's really job threatening, I think it's important to say, Melissa, I like you. I really don't want to lose you, but we can't continue this way. Not going to work.
And one other thing I want to touch on, and this seems basic, but it's so important to keep it in mind. And I was reminded at my Lighter Capital's last offsite, the importance of this. Keeping everyone in the loop and communications. Your main topic is always the same. Where your organization has come from, where it is today, and where it's going. In essence, your job is communicating the story of your organization and culminating in the vision of its glorious future. I loved that. And you think, because you're thinking this, you've got the loop going constantly in your head. You're thinking that people must be bored of hearing this story over and over again. And then you realize, like, they're not there. They're not living inside your head. And the importance of saying, communicating the vision, the story, what you're doing over and over again, but also communicating in different ways, because people hear differently and absorb information differently. How did you just make that? Is that just part of who you are, or what steps did you take to make sure that was happening at SVB?
Well, first of all, I don't know if it's part of who I am or if it's something I learned. It's hard to tease those apart. But I would say that, well, if you have any relationships that are significant, you realize that you do a lot of thinking that you don't necessarily express. But you often think you expressed it because you thought it so often that if you think something 20 times, even if you don't tell the other person, you begin to think they know it. They must have heard it. But the truth is, we don't often express ourselves as much as we need to if we want other people to hear what we want them to know. So it shouldn't be embarrassing to fundamentally, on a regular and ongoing basis, tell people about the future. The other thing is, good leaders are visionary. Good leaders aren't about, how do we get the job done today? They delegate that. Good leaders are about, where are we headed and how will we have to change in order to get there? The other thing that's important about the future is you've got to be able to describe the future concretely, and not in some vague way that makes it sound highly theoretical, but it's a little bit, for want of a better analogy, but this one's a pretty good one. Most people have heard of Moses, and most people know Moses was leading these Hebrews through the desert for 40 years. And, people get awfully distracted and bored running around in the desert for 40 years. So Moses allegedly had to, on a regular and ongoing basis, remind them of why this was important, where they were headed, what it was going to look like when they got there, and why and how they would be better off. Because the truth is, nobody likes a leader who tells them the future is going to be wonderful. I'm going to be a billionaire.
Yeah.
And you're going to work hard.
Yeah.
They want to know why it's good for them. What's in it for me? And it's got to be concrete sounding. Yeah. And it's got to be real. You can't just make it up.
So basic, but it's so important. And I think something that a lot of leaders don't keep in mind on a daily basis.
The other thing that many leaders don't keep in mind that I really want to underscore, because I do think this is extremely important, and that is that the people that work for you are subconsciously copying you. And if there's one thing that most people hate, it's a hypocrite. Somebody who says, do this, but I personally do that. And they are subconsciously copying you. I don't know how to explain it. And I don't know that there is a rock solid explanation, but I know for a fact that people are copying your behavior.
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about Silicon Valley Bank and what happened, 16 months ago now. I mean, this incredible institution was built, best in class, and then overnight it was finished.
In a day and a half.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a long day and a half for many of us.
It was awful. It was like
Our
finding
long
a
40s.
good
Yeah.
friend just died
Yeah.
of a mysterious illness. It was so sad. I'm not an expert, but I do have an opinion. I wasn't there. I had formally extricated myself in 19. The last 10 years, I only focused on China anyway, so I wasn't really part of the management.
Yeah.
And shockingly, they never told me what they thought about things after that. So,
Yeah. Right.
yeah. But I think there are two answers to the question. One of them is, why did they take excess deposits and invest them in long-term treasuries? And I don't know the answer to that, although I can speculate. But I can tell you that, number one, it's banking 101. Don't
Yeah.
take excess deposits and put them into anything long-term.
Yeah.
Because you have to have those deposits available at all times in case somebody wants them back.
Yeah.
So our habit over the decades had been try to keep the loan to deposit ratio at 80%. 80% loans, meaning out of every $100 in deposits, you only lend out 80%. You keep, and we stuck to that as best we could. And in my era anyway, and I'm not saying it's all my really good decision making, but we had generally the practice of, if you gave us 100 million, you were a customer. You gave us 100 million in deposits, and that was threatening to raise our deposits too high. We would encourage you, we'd say, please put 20 million on our balance sheet, and let's take the other 80 million and we'll put it with a money market mutual fund company where they'll do a better job than we can because they're laser focused on that and we're not.
The bank giving away deposits. That's, yeah.
We did that all the time. It was heartbreaking, but we did it. Federated was our primary destination for those excess deposits. And that kept things in line. Now, what happened at SVB was in 2019, they had about 50 billion in deposits and 40 billion in loans. So 80%, right? And then the central banks around the world flooded the markets with cash because of COVID largely. A lot of that cash found its way to Silicon Valley Bank. And rather than tell people, we have to put it for you in a better place, they put it on their balance sheet. So by 2024, at the beginning of 2024, they had like 300 billion in deposits and only 40.
Or 23, yeah. Beginning of 23, yeah. Okay.
Yes. And then what happened next? I'll blame it on the CFO, but I can't technically say I was there to see it, so I don't know that's true. But conceptually, it was a CFO who must have said, God, I really want to make money off that.
Right.
Yeah. And I will tell you, every CFO of a bank, they generally speaking don't have a lending background. And they're generally speaking jealous of lenders because lenders are the backbone and they're the heroes. And CFOs tend to think, God, I'm a CFO. I'm much smarter than the lenders. I should be the hero.
Yeah.
So I want to make some money and prove it.
Yeah. And
I think that's what happened. But what still baffles me is, and baffles everybody, is how did that get by the second, third, fourth, and fifth lines of defense, which is what we call how to get past the board, how to get past the head of risk management, how did it get past what we call the ELCO, asset liability committee. How did it get past the finance committee of the board? And finally, why did the regulators let him do it? Because the regulators, in my experience, during my 10 years as CEO, could have made me do anything if they'd wanted to. And there's no recourse. You can't take the Federal Reserve to court. You just have to do what they tell you.
Yeah.
And why they didn't make the management team do something different with those deposits, it just utterly baffles me.
Weren't they just asleep at the wheel? Do you think anybody even had a debate over it?
I think they're asleep at the wheel. I do. I don't think they had a debate over it. And I also think that now they're trying to cover their butts by propagating the theory that it was our business model.
Mm.
I don't get it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing your opinion on that. And thank you for the time. The book Leading Through Culture is really a great book. It's a short read, and besides being very informative, it's very entertaining. In fact, I have a suggestion. You have so many places in the book where you say, if you're not this, or don't do this, or don't like doing this, get out. I think you could create like a 3 or 4 page pamphlet with all of those, I don't know, I'd call them maybe Kenisms on here's how to, see if you're really cut out for this role. And this is what it's all about. And it's so direct, which I love. So thank you for that.
Fun to spend time with you. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Bootstrapped, the Lighter Side. To receive future episodes, subscribe using your favorite podcast platform. And if you enjoy this show, please share it with other fellow founders and entrepreneurs. For more insights, helpful tips, and to learn more about founder-friendly financing options, visit us at lightercapital.com. That's LIGHTERCAPITAL.com.